Welcome to Thriving Together, Stories from CCEJ, a podcast from the California Conference for Equality and Justice. Our mission is to educate and empower youth and adults to lead change for equity and justice in our communities. I'm Daniel Solis, your host. In this episode, listen to a thought-provoking panel discussion from CCEJ's Building Bridges in Divided Times webinar, originally recorded for the United Against Hate Week in September 2024. I was joined in this recording by 5 amazing panelists to explore what it truly means to build bridges in a divided world. Our panelists were Alyssa Barrett, Western Justice Center, Maya Ferdman, UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, Rina Hajat-Carroll, CCEJ, Aziza Hassan, New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, and Shafin Roberts, Caruso School of Law at Pepperdine University. Let's listen.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Barrett. My pronouns are she, her, aya, and I am the Executive Director of the Western Justice Center.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Rina Hajat-Carroll. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of CCEJ, or the California Conference for Equality and Justice.
My name is Maya Ferdman. I am the Deputy Director of the UCLA Badari Kindness Institute, which also oversees the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate and the UCLA Dialogue Across Difference Initiative, for which I'm the Staff Director, and my pronouns are she and her.
Hello, everyone. My name's Aziza Hassan. I'm the Executive Director of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hello, everybody. My name is Shafin Roberts. I'm Senior Director and Adjunct Professor at the Caruso School of Law in Strauss. I'm also a lead trainer for the Institute. My pronouns are he and him.
So first, we just want to set some context. We have bridge building in the title of this dialogue, but it would be helpful to hear, what does bridge building mean, right? How is it different from courageous conversations or creating brave spaces or other terms that we've heard for how do we dig into conflict? So Aziza, would love to start with your thoughts on how do you define this work?
So I would say that bridge building has really 2 essential ingredients. The one starts with compassion and the second is grit. I've had so many hard conversations over the years. They're especially intense these days. And as people have walked in, I'm talking about religious leaders, people who have been doing this and having hard conversations with their congregants, but where I've convened them, different religious leaders across difference. And in some of the debrief meetings that we've had afterwards, one of the people said, they were like, I thought we were all gonna, bridging means getting along and finding common ground. And the truth is that preconditions that we're also all gonna agree, I don't think is always actually the goal. I think the essential part of bridge building is to deepen our understanding and to create space to hear individuals who we don't necessarily understand and we don't necessarily agree. And maybe by the end of the conversation we won't, but that we are creating the conditions for people to be able to say brave things about things that matter to them so that we can start to creatively problem solve together, and that sometimes bridging takes a lot more effort and time and compassion than any of us necessarily have a reservoir for, and we have to keep on filling our reservoir and keep on increasing our own capacity to be able to stay in the bridging work itself.
Yeah, I love what Aziza just said there, compassion and grit. So I look at bridge building, first of all, as an adjective, 2 ways, right? So I look at it as an adjective, as an umbrella term, right? So you think about it in terms of there's so much work that goes into this space of that we're all doing similar things when we think about peacekeeping and peace building. But bridge building is I look at it as an umbrella term that kind of helps unify the field that we and I think our group, that's even on this call here, we grappled with that earlier on, what is in, what is not, because you look at ADR, alternative dispute resolution, for instance, but not all ADR practices are bridge building, right? You have a lot of things that just don't fit inside that category. But as a verb, I think bridge building, I do think that it acknowledges differences while seeking to find commonality amongst them, right? So we're not saying that we all agree, but we do, the work I do with law enforcement, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where it's this is an officer and this is a community member, and they may not agree. They may walk away from that conversation still not agreeing on the interaction that happened, but they can agree on the way in which we are going to communicate. Right? There's layers of agreement that we can find. And so I think that's a part of it. I think identifying how these differences kind of can complement each other is important. I think speaking courageously, like that's, when you think about the idea of that, that includes elements of bridge building, but like vulnerability and empathy and critical thinking and all that, mindfulness. But I think it's different in that, like the connection is not necessarily the goal, but honest and authentic communication. So I think with bridge building, I'm looking to connect, even if it's as basic as human to human. Like we can start there. We may not agree on many other details, but we can agree that we're in this room. There's certain fundamental things that we can agree on, and I look to find where those threads are.
Thank you so much, Aziza and Shafin, for just laying all that groundwork. I think the only quick thing I would add around bridge building in terms of thinking about its definition is that for us, it is really about the goal is around feeling heard, feeling seen, feeling understood to the best possible way, in the best possible way. We can't fully be understood, but to whatever capacity that we have within ourselves to feel understood is important.
So I would say, I think Aziza, Shaf, and Rina all touched on different elements of the world of bridge building. I'd want to zoom out and say, I see bridge building as a sort of collection of capacities and skill sets and structures to get from one place to another. To when we talk about bridges connect one and another. Something, if we think about physical bridges, that's infrastructure connecting us one to the other. So if I think about bridge building in the world of, in the social world, bridges are social infrastructure. They're skills to be able to reach across our differences. They're different kinds of groupings and opportunities to meet one another across our differences. What those skills consist of, I think, are really what Aziza, Shafin, and Rina were highlighting. But I do see it as we have to understand, what are we building bridges between? And there are different goals, I think, when it comes to bridge building. On the one hand, you might decide that you really want to build a bridge between you and a family member who disagree on a political issue. Maybe you are trying to bridge communities or constituents in your own, if you're a leader in your own organization or in your own community. Or, in our case at UCLA, in our own campus, what are the bridges we need to build in our own campus community to continue being a campus community? So that's how I would define it and start to approach it, as really a piece of social infrastructure to different ends.
I think what I would add, coming from the Western Justice Center perspective, working in TK through 12 education, is that bridge building is the muscles for democracy. If our goal is to live in a healthy, pluralistic, multiracial democracy, that requires us to constantly navigate difference. And so whether we are building bridges in a structured, intentional way in specific settings, whether we're in a mediation or we're in an interracial dialogue, or whether we're just learning basic social emotional skills around connecting, empathetic and active listening, the ability to manage our own emotions so we can stay present and really take in what another person is saying. All of those core skills are sort of the muscles for democracy. And the more we develop and practice and strengthen, the more we all go to the gym together, which is really what this bridge building work is, the stronger our democracy is. And I think it's often something that is called on in times of crisis rather than seen as essential skill sets or capacity or infrastructure. And I hope we are learning as a society that this work has to be at the center of everything and not an afterthought.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa. And actually, I'm really glad you brought up democracy, because that's actually kind of the next question I want us to explore. We are in the middle of yet another contentious presidential election season, right? It seems to be the norm for our country. And so in this moment of like really high stakes election, really high charged rhetoric, and also violence, right, to be frankly honest, what do you think are the consequences for this moment if we don't do bridge building? And Alyssa, if you want to start us off, since you already were taking us in that direction.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Daniel, I think you named a number of the things, right? We see sort of the metastasization of political violence. We see people's hesitation to participate in the electoral process, a lack of faith in the results of the electoral process. Um, I want to name that this event is part of United Against Hate Week. And we, over the last 10 years, have seen huge spikes in both documented prosecutable crimes motivated by hate, but also a real flaring up of hate incidents or escalation of everyday conflict, right? And so I think we have to ask ourselves what kind of society we want to live in, what type of work we're willing to do to excavate and face the roots of the conflict that we find ourselves in now. Because really, then we are, particularly in American society, perpetually kicking several very large systemic problems always down the road. And they inevitably come back to us in the form of violence. So we can get ahead of them or we can wait for the next cycle. But I think it behooves us to lean into that process of facing what is.
I mean, just thank you for that, Elisa. I just, so to that end though, I think I look at that and I feel like we're wasting time. You know, if we don't get this right, I think we're and so things are not going well. I mean, I think that's an understatement. And I think that we're wasting time and time slipping away. And we're really moving toward like a real falling apart of society. And the time that we're wasting is also missed opportunity. Because just like Elisa was talking about, like, you know, we're kicking these issues down the road when really we should be, when are we going to recognize, hey, the crisis is here? And I hope, I was hoping last time, like anytime, when these moments occur, that's an opportunity for intervention. It really is. Like when the patient is sick, you recognize there's a problem. And I don't know if we're recognizing, at what point are we going to recognize, you know, there's a problem. I think, you know, I'm seeing more positional entrenchment and a perpetual cycle of misunderstanding. And like ultimately I see civil unrest, like a serious civil unrest and an unraveling of society, because people are moving into these really extreme positions on a personal level. I think that as you see a lot of damaged relationships, you know, interpersonally, and across communities. But I think that, you know, I hate to be doom and gloom. I think the positive is that there is a heightened focus on the divide, which means there's this critical opportunity for change, right? Because people can actually see the problem in real time. I'm hoping that we're all seeing the same thing. Like, you know, me, you'll recognize and the theme for me is, well, where can I find the commonality? Where can we look and agree that the color is blue, the sky is blue? Can we agree? Where can we see? So hopefully we're looking at this and we're seeing this unraveling, we're seeing this contentiousness, and we're saying, hey, you know what? We can do better. There's got to be a better way. And I hope that's the calling into the work that we're talking about here, which is bridge building and helping us create a better community that we all wish to live in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shafin. And I don't think you're being doom and gloom. I think, you know, you're raising the stakes and you're being clear why is this work so important in this moment. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I was going to agree completely with Daniel. Thank you, Shafin. I think you're being real about the situation, and it needs to be elevated for us to all maybe pay attention a little bit differently. For me, this ties two things together, what Elisa just said about civic engagement and what Maya talked about in terms of social infrastructure. I think if we don't do this, if we don't get it right, we will absolutely see this decline in civic engagement. And that's simultaneously going to happen with a weakening of our overall social infrastructure, and the social infrastructure around specifically building connections, building community, so that when a mosque burns, when a synagogue is defamed, when a Black person is called the N-word out in the street, we are all there to show up for one another. Not that we continue to stay in our silos of racial and ethnic communities, but instead we really cross bridge, right? Cross racially bridge together. And we're saying we as a community, we as Southern California are not standing for this. We are better than this. And we're going to show up and we're going to do it every single time. But if we don't bridge build, if we don't keep that at the center, like Alyssa said earlier, if we don't keep that at the center, then we risk so much in terms of making this the best region that we all know is possible.
You know, I'm also oscillating between am I going to be doom and gloom, or am I going to raise the stakes or be hopeful? I think I see when we think about the promise of building bridges, to Elisa's point, we're thinking about the promise of democracy. If we do not build our muscle to reach across our very toxic divides right now, we're not going to enjoy the promise of pluralism or the promise of democracy in the way that we could, or the promise of diversity for that matter. We are so much richer as organizations, as communities, as cities, as a country, when we are able to understand one another across lines of difference, and when we are able to see one another and connect with one another across lines of difference. We're better problem solvers. If we don't have those capacities, we get entrenched. We're not good advocates or activists, even if that's our goal. And so I'll say, even in the university context, because that's where I'm based now, we can't meet our educational mission as an institution of higher education if students are afraid to speak, right? Or if students are distrustful of one another to such a degree, and not just students, faculty, staff, if we are distrustful to the point of breaking, we can't fulfill our higher educational mission. And I think that applies across the board. It's not just an education issue, but an issue in government and in K through 12 and across the board.
Now, I want to come back to something also Maya just brought up, is that we can't even really advocate well around the very things that we care about if we don't understand other perspectives. And like United States, let's just talk practically, from a practical pluralism perspective. We're shifting into a minority majority country. That doesn't just mean that minorities are like going to take over, which is part of the issue that people are scared about, whoever people are. The point is that there's so much diversity in America that we have to be able to work across those differences. Like if we care about anything, including being able to work on issues like housing, et cetera, we're going to have to be able to talk through that hard conversation. And housing is one of the toughest conversations you can have in communities. That we need to be able to address it because it's right here. The other piece that I also want to come to, which Brina brought up around solidarity, Maya Berry from the American Arab Institute recently had congressional testimony, and she was just talking about hate crimes and hate incidences and things that like terrible things that are happening in our society, and the way she was responded to. And by the way, she's been a bridge builder for decades. In multiple places in our federal government and beyond. And she's worked with other groups, and you'll understand why in a minute, but she's the way she was responded to by an elected official, who I will just intentionally not name right now, was not to just listen to what she said, but to actually engage in deeply concerning questioning, instead of actually addressing the hate that she was trying to raise. He was othering and basically saying, like, by the end of what he said, you should put your head in a bag. And right after that, it was actually not just Muslim groups, or she's a Muslim American woman who runs an Arab American Institute, but it was actually multiple groups from multiple perspectives that came up and said, we've been working with Maya for decades. This isn't okay. Like when we're talking about this political season, you can ground it here. Like the Institute for Social and Political Understanding has shown they've been tracking things for some time, and they've shown that it's not just events or international events. Like they actually don't kick hate up. It's actually not, that's not the indicator that actually kicks hate up in our country. It's political rhetoric that kicks hate up in our country. And in any election season, that's when hate actually takes a nice boost. And so as we are entering into this election season, or I mean, we're almost there, we're really close, things are going to get worse. And it's going to be really important for people to stand up and be there for each other, and to literally be the solid bystander of actually stepping in and saying, I saw what happened, I'm here for you. Because it's also pragmatically, like, we're all going to feel it, and we're going to feel it across the difference. We might not think that we're somehow immune, but I was just recently in San Diego and reminded of an individual who first attacked and killed people at a synagogue in Poway, and then set a mosque on fire in Escondido. And so I think that there's something to be paid attention to, that we're not all immune, and that we have a really important role to play around solidarity.
And I think we've all been talking about, I think, some of the underlying issues, needs, right, that are kind of behind all this conflict, hate, violence that we're seeing. So maybe just to move us just really deeper into that conversation, thinking about all just these various conflicts, violence, hate incidents, what do we think are some fundamental needs in our country that are not being met, that are leading to this conflict, that are escalating this conflict? And needs, right? And we talk in restorative justice a lot about that unmet needs often being the driver or fuel of conflict.
Right. Wow. So this is a really great a great question, right? And so Rena said earlier that bridge building, she said it's about being kind of seen and heard, and I think that truly being heard and seen on like is critical. Like I feel like both sides, or whatever the sides are, feel invisible to each other, right? And rightfully so, because it's like they're in their space, and kind of speaking from that place. And so actually my dissertation was actually based on this issue. Let me explain. I'll explain it like this, right? So in research, there's something called type 1 and type 2 errors. And so a type 1 error is a false positive. So like, let's say you go to get a COVID test, and it says you have COVID, but you don't. Okay, so whatever, okay, that's one type of error. Type 2 is a false negative, which means the COVID test says that you don't have COVID, but you do. And so imagine walking around with these symptoms. You're coughing, you're shivering, and everyone's saying, "Hey, that's just in your head. You're not really sick." It can be crazy. It can be crazy. It's like, are you kidding me? And I think that's what's happening in society today, regardless of the position. But I think people feel validated by the other side, whoever the other side is. Right. So there's a theory called social identity theory. And I think, Aziza, you were just talking about othering. This is the theory, right? It's called social identity theory. It explains how people derive their identity and self-esteem from their group membership. And so this isolation it serves to reinforce this dynamic, because when I don't find what I'm looking for, if I'm not being validated by you, I'm going to go back into my group and reinforce and find validation there, which is further isolating and driving this wedge between us. So then what you have are groups of people feeling unseen and unvalidated, and then what you get are more people acting out to be seen, and so yelling louder, so to speak, or doing outrageous things because you're going to hear my point of view. And I think we just need to this is critical. We need to slow down and say, okay, look, even if we have to be in community with each other. Even the folks that are out there doing whatever. So okay, what's happening? What underlying need do you need met for us to be in community together? So I think that we need to recognize what it is. I think it starts with being seen and being heard.
Honestly, don't have too much to add because I think Shafin really got it. The only thing I would just really briefly say is January 6th was outrageous. And I think it is exactly to Shafin's point that people are not being heard, they're not being understood, they're not being seen. There aren't spaces for people to do this really critical work. And so then we have these really ridiculous events that are happening that are damaging in so many ways. And I think the need is that the need that is being missed is creating healthy community, healthy connections where people feel validated.
I think to Rena's point, I think, Shafin, you captured the need to be seen and heard. I would add one more element to it that Aziza and I actually talk about a lot in the world of Muslim-Jewish relations, especially right now, in the environment we're in right now, which is the idea, the sense of threat that if I were to see you, that would somehow necessitate denying being seen myself. that to recognize your pain is a denial of my pain and vice versa, which I think makes seeing one another all the more threatening and difficult. I think that's a false proposition. I think, in the words of Rabbi Sharon Brous, our hearts are more capacious than that. I think that we are capable of seeing the pain of different people at once and holding that pain at once. And I think that that's necessary. So I think that that's just the one element I would add on. I'll add one more thing. That what are the needs that aren't being met, that are leading to conflict, which is basic needs. The need to be safe, the need to feel like I have enough food to eat, the need to feel like I can afford my rent, the need to feel like my children are safe. I think that those basic needs exacerbate the lack of feeling safe or feeling like I can thrive, leads to the need to be heard more desperately. We have to be able to simultaneously recognize those basic needs for safety, for affordability, for other kinds of just survival needs of a human being. And then also, coupled with that, those sort of higher order needs of being seen and understood in fullness. They go together. I think they're inherently together. And in doing so, not see my need or your need as zero sum, but let's actually work together. Like a Republican and a Democrat both need to eat, right? Or both need to be able to live with a roof over their heads, or need to address the homelessness crisis. How do we build a bridge to be able to address our basic needs, not in adversarial nature, but in a way that can actually meet all of our needs and see all of them at the same time?
Just to add to the dimension of the conversation, like when Maya brings up safety, I think part of what is at stake is like, and like also Shafin and Rena, is like that we're not listening well enough about what those needs are, and we're not taking them seriously enough to really focus on addressing the specifics of them. And when we can do that and do that well, then we get somewhere. But there's needs like safety, and safety when like it's one person's safety, but also paying attention to how their need for safety and the requests for additional infrastructure and safety, how does that impact other communities? And like and their actual like safety. Like I was talking to a young woman yesterday who talked about how she'd been out advocating for the thing that she cared about, and now when she had been protesting and working, like really advocating for justice, and the police had been called, and now all of a sudden the police that she thought were initially, like before she used to see them as protectors, her eyes welled up with tears, and she was like, "Get away from me. I want nothing to do with you. I don't feel safe anymore." And so like I think there's real serious, complex, important issues that we need to understand, and they're going to be a little bit different for each person. Their essence will be very similar, and when one person's safety is at the cost of another person's safety, I think we have to spend a little bit more time engaging, because it's not always as simple as we want the problem to be. It's going to take a lot more creativity, a lot more problem solving, and a lot more love to try to figure out how we can do it differently in each community. But there's also some important threads that we can thread throughout all, where we can also learn a little bit without having to relearn all the time. And so like, thinking about these things of like, what does real dignity mean for each person? What does real access to resources mean? Like in my community, we were talking about how, all right, we have individuals and they need some extra support, but like, we don't want to just give them what's in our pantries. We actually now have a refrigerator and a kitchen that people can actually go to if they need to, and they can pick up whatever they want. It doesn't have to be an appointment with anybody or anything like that. They have the ability to stop in when they feel like they can, and to take what they want or leave with something. And if anything, it's added to a greater culture of generosity, where people can access things and where they don't have to ask. Sometimes like even asking is such a big thing for people, and like recognizing that it's not like, sometimes I don't even know that I have the words to string them together to ask for the thing that I really want, but somebody giving me the service of listening to me will help me sometimes even find those words. And that is a gift that we can give to each other, and it's something that will actually make all of us stronger and feel like we belong in a culture of greater generosity, instead of like it's a handout from one way to the other. Like, let me make sure everybody actually gets to feel like they're a full human being and they have a little bit more autonomy, even when they need a little bit of help. And what does it mean to really create that culture of belonging in a way that people believe it? They actually believe it. The last thing I'll end with is there's this university president at Middlebury. Her name is Lori Patton. And what they talked about was they had a really big mess up, I guess, in 2016 or 2017. Don't know all the details. It was like, I know college is under a lot of scrutiny right now for like handling everything terribly, but like they handled something terribly in 2016, 2017. They looked at it and they decided they reviewed it and said, okay, here's what we did wrong. We had all this infrastructure. Here's what we can do better next time. And from that harsh learning in 2017, whenever that was, they started to build an infrastructure of conflict resolution in every part of the university. So it was like before people do an internship, they do a conflict resolution program. All the faculty are all trained in restorative justice and conflict resolution and deep listening. And the person who runs all these programs is constantly taking and retaking conflict resolution, because this is something that you have to just keep on building muscle around and community around. It's not a one-time thing. It's not something that's top down. It's like, it's constant. It's a way of life. And the more we can integrate it, the more we can actually start to identify some of these really essential fundamental needs that you're asking about.
It's really humbling to be in community with the others who are speaking today. And thank you for your service and your wisdom and your very long-term commitment to this work. You know, I think we just need to take a step back and say democracy is a relatively new experiment. And I'm not talking about the 1770s, I'm talking about the 1960s. So I would say that an attempt to fully realize American democracy is just that new. I think we also have to acknowledge that we're at a period where the gap between the wealthiest people and the poorest people in our society is the largest it's been since the 1890s, which was another period of immense economic disruption with industrialization. And we are in the middle of that, but it's on the side of technology and information. So yes, to all of the things that my friends and colleagues have said, and that in those moments where there is so much instability and disruption, working to find ways that we foster connection that are about increasing the largeness of our hearts and strengthening the bridges rather than building taller walls or setting ourselves into echo chambers. That's how we find our way to grapple with some of the very complex needs and problems.
This next question, which I think we've already been naming, right, about this last round of like fundamental needs that are not being met. We just want to dig a little bit more into how our society, how culture in the US maybe actually moves us in the different direction, where it fosters conflict avoidance and kind of avoiding being vulnerable and being real about our needs that are coming up. So how do you see that happening? How do you see the culture in the United States maybe contributing to conflict avoidance? And how does that make it harder to address and heal these really deeply rooted issues?
Big question. I'll try to be very brief and just say, we are not incentivized to depolarize in ourselves or in society. In ourselves, our brains are wired, as Shafin was saying earlier, to group people, to categorize other people, to place ourselves into us and them. It's easier, it's simpler, it's more immediately gratifying to do this. And so we're not personally incentivized. At a social level, our society, our media system is not incentivized to tell complex stories. And so our social media algorithm is not incentivized to share stories that are not extra clickable and divisive. And our politics are not designed, or our politicians are not incentivized to be thoughtful and inclusive. The reason that our politicians have become more extreme is because it gets them elected. I'll also just say vulnerability. We don't have spaces. If we think about the college campus, we talked about like this example in Middlebury, an example of college presidents that are demonstrating vulnerability in actually, we did something wrong. Let's make amends, which is such an essential core part of restorative. And yet our leaders are not incentivized to do that because they're under enormous scrutiny, oftentimes under congressional sort of, they're being called up by Congress, they're being demanded of by donors. And so we don't have an ecosystem where leaders are incentivized to be vulnerable either. I have thoughts on how we might address it, but maybe I'll just stop on that pessimistic note since you asked us to be brief, and maybe later we can talk about how to actually incentivize ourselves and others to depolarize.
You know, as I think of like the models that we have out in public and in the public sphere, it's hard to, like, so much of my language and my ability to navigate through hard things comes from watching other people do it well. And I think of how few and far between, like, I have to seek those models. I have to like look for them. And they're actually fewer to see. If anything, you see a model of sound bites or giving people harsh feedback and then people move on or whatever it is. And I think hard things need to be said, and giving people practice saying those hard things in places where they can still say them well so that people won't stop listening is one of those intentional things that we can do as a society. And there's really not many places that do that. There are a few, and they do it well. And some of us are still learning in all sorts of ways. And, you know, I think being real about the learning is important. The other thing that's really, I'm coming to this idea that Maya brought up about our brains and how they're wired and the infrastructure around us and how it's wired, is we're still wired to care for each other. And so how can we actually lean into that? Because the rest of the wiring, oh my goodness, we're in trouble. But like there is still something that's in the wiring that we can do. And the last thing is what Elisa brought up around grounding, resourcing, and processing. I don't see hardly any places for that. And it's the essential ingredient for any hard conversation to keep people at the table. And yet we're rewarded more when we just speak truth to power in a really strong way and we move on. And those are really the models. And having places for the processing is essential.
So I think Maya and Aziza very articulately outlined the instinct for polarization and the space where we're not supporting the alternative, but also that we, as Aziza said, but we are also wired to care for each other. So I think I want to focus on how does a society foster vulnerability? I mean, this is essentially the work that we all are doing with people in education and in community building in various contexts. We can have inclusive education that includes intentional instruction in social emotional skills and social emotional learning. We can lean into the wisdom of indigenous practice, which is what restorative justice is grounded in. We can lean into spiritual practice. Many of us are organizations, some of us are separate from faith, but many of us are grounded in connection to spiritual practice, or organizationally, maybe that's not our focus, but personally, that's a wellspring for us as leaders. I think we can acknowledge that the brain has enormous unexplored territory in the frontal lobe. It is the place where empathy comes alive. And if we want to have a society where people are acting in the limbic brain, we can structure things so that we reinforce that. And if we want a society where people are operating out of their executive center, out of their frontal lobe, out of the place where empathy lives and grows, that we have to start young and we have to include it in every stage of life, in TK through 12 education, in undergraduate education, in graduate education, and in this process of lifelong learning, like Aziza said, where we don't learn how to do mediation or restorative circle, or we don't just learn it once. We learn again and again and again, and every time we turn the globe, we see a different part of it. So I think that's how we do it. We make it easier to address and heal from conflict as we develop that and reinforce that skill set over and over and over again, and create as much infrastructure for people to hook into that experience as they can, because it feels a lot better than polarization, actually. Right? So we have the algorithm of the addictive algorithm of conflict and pain and fear, but there's another algorithm in life that we could lean into. It's slower, requires more interpersonal connection and work, but once we're hooked into that, it's incredibly sustaining and sustainable.
I'll just say that I think society has normalized callous communication in a way that is celebrated, and I think that's the problem. I think we live for the soundbite. I think, as you mentioned, that this whole soundbite thing. Our attention spans have been reduced based on the technology, like consumption, and so we don't even have the capacity or interest to do the rich mining that comes from like deep listening and genuine curiosity. And I think we need to think that through, right? Like we've got these built-in echo chambers. I can literally use technology to curate my world, to just be like, I'm not interested in whatever you're saying, I'm not into it. Right? And that can be good for some, if you want to like go into like a positive space, but like, that also cannot like be not healthy. I will say too, we need to look at society in general, about the stories we've told ourselves. All of our hero stories, think about this for a second, from Gilgamesh to Odysseus, we're warriors. I mean, so we celebrate the thing that we're talking about is killing us. So I'm just going to say that, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. But I think we need to think about, we talked about vulnerability. Where are the heroes that are vulnerable? Like in my growing up from my neighborhood, that was like, you weak, man. We talking about you. We have, there's a lot of words for that aren't masculine. That don't feel like, that's, identifying with strength. And so I think that's something that we should revisit. And how do we revisit that? Can't just be on like a local level. I think it should be on a societal level, especially if that's something that we agree with in terms of identifying as a value.
I just wanted to offer that I think answer this question about society at large, I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge and that we go through some type of reckoning of the origins of conflict in communities of color in particular, and in immigrant communities. And for women too. I don't want to dismiss us and our struggle with this, but I think in this country we have been very clear that it is prioritized to acquiesce, to accommodate, and actually what's prioritized is don't be seen and don't be heard, right? And we can look at the Asian myth of the model minority, and we can see the precedence that has taken in racism and in these conversations about systemic racism and social racism. And what we were told was just put your head down, do what you're told. And communities of color have this message has been emphasized over and over again. And so then what happens is that over time, you become conflict avoidant, because that is actually a means of survival. Because if you're not, you're met with violence. And we know those stories all too well. And so at what point do we unlearn that and actually say, no, we want to be seen and heard, and we must be seen and heard. And if we don't, then our lives are being compromised. And so we've got to do some I think education there of what are we the products of, right? In terms of and Elisa, I loved your point about this is new. This is the last 100 years. These issues are fresh. And so even when you personalize, as a woman of color, I can tell you in my immigrant family, we avoid conflict like the plague. We don't talk about conflict. We don't do it well. And then here I am, right, in this restorative justice organization with individuals and colleagues who get this to a beautiful, beautiful degree. And I come to my family trying to express needs and trying to demonstrate conflict in healthy ways. And of course, I'm met with resistance, right? And this is in a very personal experience. I see smiling and head nodding because I think people do understand this on a very personal level. And so I'm going personal to global because I think there's such connections here.
I definitely feel the challenges of trying to bring restorative questions to your family and them acting like, what is this? With our final few minutes, we want to do a speed round of our wonderful panelists who have been amazing. Thank you. Bringing it back to kind of our personal level, right? What is one idea that you want to share with all our participants today that they can start doing to bring bridge building to their personal lives?
That's a tall order, Danielle. Just one. I'm going to force myself to just do one. The very first thing I would say, and the only for the purpose of this conversation, ask yourself, what are the questions you're not asking? of your neighbor, of your parent, of your peer, of your colleague, and ask that question. Start with yourself. Ask that question and see what happens. See what's created as a result.
I hope that we can take serious how important it is to build community around us of people who are willing to practice bridge building and mediation and hard conversations with each other. That having a core group of people that you can rely on and bounce things off of is what will help sustain your skill, keep you accountable, and start to create the community and the infrastructure that will have other ripples in other parts of your life.
Yeah, this is how in sync we are. I was just writing the words, the ripple effect. So that's something we talk about a lot working in TK through 12 education. And I would say each one teach one. So if you've learned, if you have skill set, how are you putting that to use? How are you throwing the stone into the still waters and creating that ripple? Are you mentoring? Are you getting into a fellowship? Are you guest speaking somewhere? Are you joining a board? Are you donating? Whatever it is, are you turning to someone in the grocery line who says something in an attacking way and saying, I'm sorry, we don't speak that way in our community. Stop.
Seek out relationships with people who think differently. Because I think that you want to start building bridges. Like, I think you need to start internally before do the work for sure, but I think start with inside, because you can't show someone how to get to a destination you haven't been to. And so when you hear somebody and you're hearing something that you disagree with, I would say work on listening with non-judgment and curiosity. So that feeling that's stirring up inside of you when you're in that conversation, I would say recognize it and examine it, because that's what's happening with other people, and that's what's driving them into their. So because once you learn how to navigate that for yourself, you'll be better able to navigate it for others. And we're all grappling with multiple versions of ourselves. So I would say the version that's like the version that's wise and is and knows how to respond, and the one that's reactive, and the one that's like, let me tell you how I really feel. And so I would say start there internally with grappling with those two things and creating alignment among those two.
And my recommendation would be, if any of this resonated with you today, but you're feeling a little bit insecure about how to actually do the work, I would say get involved with all of us on this call. Elisa has great workshops. Aziza has an incredible fellowship. CCEJ offers open trainings, and then reach out to Maya and Shafin in higher ed, because they are a wealth of knowledge and they have so many resources available to them. So reach out to all of us, because we are, as cheesy as it sounds, we are literally in this together, and we are stronger together. And we all, just for everyone's benefit, we all met 4 years ago because of Maya, and we are able to have this conversation in such an open and vulnerable way because of the relationships we've built. And so when I say we are stronger together, I truly mean that, because I think it is going to take all of us to make the Southern California that we really all desire.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists for sharing their knowledge and perspectives on how building connections rooted in community gives hope for a world where people live free of oppression and thrive. CCEJ is part of the movement in California working to prevent hate in our communities. To learn more about our panelists and their organizations, visit the description of this episode for links to resources. CCEJ's podcast is sponsored in part by LA vs. Hate, a coalition of partners led by the LA County Human Relations Commission, who are committed to preventing and ending hate in our communities. Once again, I'm Daniel Solis, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to hear more stories of thriving together.